So this is one of the more bizarre things that I've seen, and I've seen a lot of bizarre things. So a few days ago, actually, this was last Thursday, I think it was, there was this conference, and one of Putin's mouthpieces, one of his advisors, said that the USSR hasn't really collapsed, so there's really no framework for Ukraine to be a sovereign Ukraine. And so I'll show you what I'm talking about. It's just weird. But it's just one more in a long line of excuses of why they can't do this or can't do that. Okay, so where are we? Anton Gerashenko posted this. Putin's advisor said that the USSR, that's the Soviet Union, continues to exist. Well, that's news to the rest of the world. And the war in Ukraine is an internal process. So if the USSR still exists, Ukraine was part of the USSR, so that would make it like a civil war, an internal matter, and I think that's what he's going for. But if that's the case, then they still own Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, and so the Baltic states should be very nervous about that, as should the other stans, Kazakhstan, and all the other countries that were made up part of the USSR. Okay, the legal procedure was violated during the collapse of the USSR. Constitutional law experts should assess the unlawful collapse of the Union, says Anton Kobalakov. He said this during the 13th St. Petersburg International Legal Forum. A number of years ago, Putin said that the breakup of the USSR was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. That's not correct. The USSR was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. That would be more accurate. Or the way that the USSR formed, why it formed, and how it grew to dominate its neighbors who were not wanting to be part of it. Okay, now Putin continues to believe that this is the greatest geopolitical catastrophe. Okay, I'll show you this in just a moment, but Michael McKay comments on this. This is why it's important to declare the Soviet Union was a criminal totalitarian regime, and the so-called Russian Federation is not and cannot be the successor state to the USSR. Well, it is a successor state to the USSR. It's what was left after the USSR broke up. It's the biggest portion of it. Ukraine was part of it, but not because they wanted to be. They wanted to be free and independent. And what I find fascinating about this is the USSR, like the Russians are always saying, hey, you know, they should have the right to freedom of self determination in Donbass. What about Ukraine as a whole wanting to be free from Russian dominance, right? That doesn't count. That's kind of messy. So, okay. Here's what he was saying in this conference. It's convoluted, but we'll try to follow along. Okay, if the Congress of the People's Deputies, aka the Congress of Soviets, created in the USSR in 1922, then it should have been dissolved by the decisions of the Congress of the very deputies. Okay, so everything rests on that. Those that formed them should be able to unform them. But what about those who were dominated by those who formed them without any input into it or any real say meaningfully? Don't they get the right of self-determination like the so-called People's Republic of the Donetsk or Luhansk People's Republic? Okay. And if the legal procedure was violated, it turns out legally the USSR exists. Okay, again, this is more convoluted kind of thinking. And they really love to do a legal procedure. Okay, so for example, the 4 territories that they stole from Ukraine and legally incorporated into the Constitution after sham elections, they love to do the legal procedure even if it completely violates the spirit of everything that's going on. But legally, we did this. We signed a paper. We did right. Okay. So next, he says this is what constitutional law experts say. It's actually not what constitutional law experts say, but okay. The event in Belovezovska Puchka, which took place on December 8th, 1991, that's the collapse of the Soviet Union, on the eve of the signing of the new Union Treaty, looks absolutely strange from the legal point of view. No, from this very esoteric, very outside the norm point of view, it may look strange, but it's not. This is the way that the entire world interprets it. But this is going to give a new reason to say this is an internal civil war. It's none of your business outside of within our country. Okay. Absolutely strange from a legal point of view. The document was later ratified by the Supreme Councils of the Russian Federation, the Ukrainian SSR, and the Belarusian SSR. Okay. So, and it was not their competence at all. That is, they don't have legal standing or legal right to do that. But, he goes on, if the USSR had not been dissolved, then logically, from a legal point of view, it turns out that the Ukrainian crisis is an internal process. That's what they're trying to argue, or that's what he's trying to argue here, that it is a family matter, an internal affair. And so it's not an international war. It's just a little dispute within the country itself. Okay, I don't buy it. Thanks to the St. Petersburg International Legal Forum, in which we are all participating, he goes on, the discussion of this situation has already begun. Again, he's trying to formulate a new legal theory. I think it won't last very long at all, but here we are. And let the constitutional law experts give a legal assessment of it. Okay. The collapse of the USSR needs a legal assessment. It will help to understand the events of the present day. It will modify our understanding of the events of the present day in a way that serves Russian interests very well. So that's what he's trying to come up with. Now, there are all kinds of reasons that Putin has used. I put this into some AI, not because I trust the AI, but because I wanted to remember if I was remembering them all. List the justifications that Russia has given for the invasion of Ukraine from the earliest to the most recent. Now, this is the list of them. And that legal dispute thing, that it's just a civil war, it's within the family, could be the next one. Okay. NATO expansion as a threat. Well, they knew that that was not the case. Well, okay. So in pre-2014, they could kind of argue that that was an issue, even though it wasn't, but they could argue that. But in 2022, when they actually invaded, it was not an issue at all, because NATO, no country can become part of NATO while there's a conflict within their border. So it wasn't going to happen. Okay, NATO expansion threat, and then protection of Russian speakers in Donbass. So they just dusted off Hitler's playbook of saying Germans are being oppressed in Czechoslovakia and Poland. Okay, denazification of Ukraine. That was another one. Where are the Nazis? Well, you can't find them. Why? It's a conspiracy. That's why. Okay, yeah, whatever. Demilitarization of Ukraine. Now, again, what Putin wanted to do was just roll over Ukraine and put it in the puppet government. He never wanted to be here 1,100 some odd days later. Okay. Historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians. That's more like it. And that's like the USSR conversation that we're having right now. This is historic Russian lands, they say, and they're returning them. Preventing Ukraine's nuclear ambitions. This is almost laughable. They didn't have nuclear ambitions until you actually invaded them. Restoration of the Russian Empire and the Soviet influence. We just talked about that one. And then countering Western aggression. But the West wasn't even paying attention to you. They weren't interested in you until you rolled over Ukraine's borders in 2022. De-Satanization of Ukraine. That was a fun one. And that's tied to Alexander Dugin and Russian Orthodox Church narratives and that sort of thing. And in response to Western sanctions and isolation, that was after the 2022 invasion. All right. So that's where we are. But again, you can rationalize everything. Everything makes sense when you rationalize after the fact. All right, my friends, I hope that was helpful to you to understand what's going on here and why he's saying what he's saying. I don't think this will get a lot of traction, but if it does, you're now prepared. Thank you for your time. Thank you for the likes, the shares, and the subscribes. And thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.